Let's have a talk, you and me. Yes, that talk. Let's talk about armor. What, were you expecting something else? You may have watched my previous guide on weapons you should have to start raiding. You may even have them all by now, but you might have noticed all those weapons don't do much if you're too dead to use it most of the time. Have you ever played with someone who dies all the time in encounters? That person who spends all your team's revive tokens, maybe even causing wipes? And people tell you, damn, just stay alive? Like, yeah, thanks, great advice, I forget I have to press the stay alive button. If that sounds familiar, then you might want to stick around, for your friend. Armor in Destiny, especially not exotics, might not be as flashy as weapons, but they are as important. Having good knowledge about how armor works can be the difference between you wasting your team's tokens, just outright causing your team to wipe, or losing that sweet boss one phase. Because DPS is very low if you can't fire your gun, This also applies to any other high difficulty content in the game, especially if you want to try out Grandmaster Nightfalls. Today we'll talk about the basics of how armor works in Destiny, and I'll give you some rules of thumb for all classes so you know which armor pieces to keep and start experimenting in the future. Also stick to the end for some mod recommendations to increase survivability even further with little effort. Let's start talking about stats. There's a lot of detail we could go into here, but I'll do my best to keep it simple and practical. Let's get this out of the way first though. We're not talking about power level. Power level is what determines if you take 2 seconds or 2 weeks killing an enemy, or if that enemy's bullets tickle or 360 no-scope you. The strat for power level is... get that number up. That's it. So let's move on to the other more interesting numbers in the game. There are 6 different stats armor provides: Intellect, Recovery, Resilience, Discipline, Strength, and Mobility. Each one can go from 0 to 100, and only increments in the tens matter. Having 49 of one stat is the same as having 40 in terms of the in-game benefits you get from said stat. Each piece of armor has a random distribution of stats as well as an overall total amount. So there are pieces that can have more overall stat than others, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're better. To know which ones are better, you need to understand what each of them do. Intellect. The higher the tier, the faster your super recharges. This is the most expensive stat to compensate for by using mods, so if you want to build with high intellect, it's more efficient to get it through armor. Recovery. This makes your health and shields start recovering faster. This stat is the easiest recommendation to max out. Almost in every scenario you can go wrong with 100 recovery. It's the second most expensive stat to compensate with mods, so when intellect is not a priority, you want this stat on your armor. Resilience. This one reduces the damage you take. This sounds really good, right? You take less damage overall, what's not to love about that? Well, on paper it sounds great. However, the damage reduction is not very noticeable, and there are some other mods that can give you a more noticeable defensive effect. Stick to the end of the video where I'll talk a bit about those. Mobility. This stat is very particular. It doesn't increase damage, health, or anything like that. It doesn't even increase your running speed, which you would think given the name of the stat, but actually mobility affects the height of your jumps and your strafing speed while aiming down sights. It has its use mostly within PvP. Discipline and Strength. Discipline reduces your grenade cooldown and Strength your melee abilities. They are both good but situational, depending on the type of build you're making, which is a great segue to talk about builds. As I mentioned before, the universal stat you want to go for is Recovery. You should max this out or get it at least 280. This applies for almost everything, PvP and PvE. Another universal stat is Resilience.
But Apollo, you said resilience is not as important, so are you having a stroke or something?
No. At least I hope not. The thing is, having some resilience is important, at least 50 resilience, especially for PvP. Having 50 resilience and up makes you survive a little bit better against the most popular weapon archetype in the Crucible to date, 120 RPM hand cannons. So being used to run 50 resil on most builds is a good habit to have. Most of their stats depend on your class and subclass, so let's start with Titans. Resilience is more important here than for other classes, because it reduces the cooldown of your barricade. So if you depend a lot on it, or you're using an exotic that takes advantage of it, then you want to run higher than 50 resilience. Now, at this point, you want to make a decision. Do you want your super, grenade, or melee ability to recharge faster? The answer is up to you to decide what you need the most. Usually, you want the most impactful skill to recharge faster, and for PvE, more times than not, you want your super to recover very quickly. Bubble, Thunder Crash, Hammers are all very strong, and you may want to be able to use them as often as you can. So if you know for a fact you need any other stat, you might probably already know what you're doing. Now let's talk about Warlocks. They are a bit trickier though. Recovery affects your Rift cooldown, and you already wanted to max that out, so that's already checked. Now you want 50 Reseal, that we talked before, and after that you get to choose. Warlocks have many subclass synergies. You might want high strength or discipline for bottom 3 Voidwalker, top 3 Dumbblade, Stasis Turret, you see my point. Or you can go with the classic high intellect for Well of Radiance or Chaos Reach. My recommendation for a basic overall build for PvE is you try going for high intellect, as normally, especially for raids, that's what you want to get back faster. However, if you're using Stasis for crowd control, focus discipline and spam that turret. Hunters. Hunters for PvE are very interesting. Mobility is the stat that reduces your dodge cooldown. However, your dodge is not a particularly useful skill for PvE, as it doesn't help your team that much. So you might want to stick with max recovery, 50 reseal, and intellect. Hunters do have some unique abilities that help your team a ton. Bottom 3 Night Stalker has a melee ability that can turn you and your allies invisible. This can be a lifesaver in PvE, so you may want to spec into strength and equip the Gambler's Dodge, which gives you your melee ability back when you use it near enemies. Also, bottom 3 Gunslinger helps you get your super faster by dealing precision damage, so you can invest into some other stats to have a better overall build, or commit to intellect to get your super very quickly. In summary, for all 3 classes, when in doubt, go for max recovery, some reseal, and high intellect. This distribution may not be the best for every single scenario, but it is a very decent one-size-fits-all strategy for starting. As you get more experience in the game, you will be able to collect armor with different roles and experiment with different distributions, which takes me to the next point. Stat distribution on armor. How do you know an armor has good or bad rolls? You should look at 2 things in a specific order. Number 1, distribution. You want the stat distribution to not be even across all stats. You want each piece to have a very high number on the stats you want and a very low number on the ones you don't. For example, if you're a Titan and get a piece of armor with high mobility, you might not want that, because who uses mobility on a Titan? It may not be a good roll unless you are doing some weird things with your build. However, armor with high recovery and intellect is way better for your build, at least the one that I'd recommend. It's also a good idea to go for the most expensive stat to already be on your armor without mods, as much as possible, because resilience is cheaper to compensate that intellect or recovery. So ideally, you want to grab armor with high recovery and intellect before one with high reseal. However, don't dismantle armor that's high on stats you want, even if it's not the most optimal distribution. You can still use intellect mods, not a crime or anything. Number 2. Total stat amount. Some armor is what we call high stat armor. This means they have more points to distribute across its stats. These pieces can reach higher numbers in your build when distributed correctly. But notice when I say correctly, because if you get a crazy 68 high stat armor roll with 30 mobility and 30 discipline, you might not want to use it compared to a shitty 44 stat armor that has almost everything in recovery and intellect. That's why distribution beats overall stats. You want your stats to be allocated to the right spots and then maximize the overall amount of points you have. Now let's talk about another way of obtaining stats: mods. Let's start with how mods work on armor. You can't just fill your armor with any mod you like. To equip a mod, you need to understand 3 systems: energy, elemental affinity, and armor piece specific mods. Energy is the number you see increasing when you upgrade your armor. It can go from 1 to 10 when you fully masterwork it. This is the energy budget you have to spend in mods for that armor piece. Each mod has a cost and you cannot go past 10 on a fully Masterwork armor piece. Elemental affinity. Each armor piece has one elemental affinity: Void, Arc, or Solar. This changes which mods you can equip on that armor, because some mods also have elemental affinity, and you can only equip a Solar mod on an armor that has Solar elemental affinity. This concept is for more advanced modding though, as most basic mods, including the ones that give you stats, don't have any affinity, which means you can equip those on any armor. Armor piece specific mods. This means, literally, which piece of armor are you trying to equip your mods on. Some mods are helmet specific, which means you can only use it on your helm, and so on for any other armor piece. And now that we've gone over all of this, let's talk about slots. The first mod slot on your armor is always dedicated to stat compensation mods. The second and third are dedicated to that specific armor piece. Helmet mods, arm mods, chest mods, you get the point. The fourth is a slot reserved for combat style armor mods. These are very special and we'll talk about them in the following video, so like, subscribe, do the thing. Right now we'll focus on stat mods, the ones that go in the first slot, with some other honorable mentions for survivability. You get the choice between minor and regular mods. Minor giving 5 points to the desired stat and costing less energy, and regular ones giving 10 and requiring more. But as you can see, not all minor and regular mods cost the same amount of energy, intellect being the most expensive, recovery being second, and every other stat tied at third place. Ideally, you want your armor stat distribution to be in a way you use the cheapest mods, so you have space to equip more mods from different slots, but you don't always get to choose, so all hail the RNG gods. Now, let's talk about some honorable mentions for chest-specific mod slots. There are 3 mods called Concussive Dampener, Sniper Damage Resistance, and Melee Damage Resistance. They all cost 1 energy and have no elemental affinity, so they work on every chest piece. Unlike Resilience, the effects are very noticeable for the cost in PvE. Note that you can only equip 2 out of 3, so swap accordingly to the thing you are dying the most from. Dying to snipers? Put 1 sniper mod. Really dying to sniper? Put 2? Yes, they also stack. And there are some other damage resistant mods, some are affinity linked like Solar, Arc, and Void specific, and some others linked to raid gear that can only benefit you inside that specific raid. So for a nice all size fits all strat, just go with the global ones. With good recovery, some reseal, and damage resistant mods, you are now more likely to die less in raids. Pair it with some common sense for even greater results. Now there's the other group of mods that are game changers in PvE, and some even work in PvP. These belong to the combat style category. Starting on season 14, this season, there is a better way of acquiring those than before, but it's still not an ideal way as it can take a long time to get them all. You can currently find combat style mods from 3 sources. Ada 1. She's the only one that can sell the good stuff as of today, so keep an eye on her inventory and buy every mod you don't have. Her mod inventory changes every day. The other 2 are the Helm's War Table and the Splicer Servitor. They sell a static collection of mods, so there's no reason to not buy them. If you don't have the more powerful mods, at least you have some alternatives. Also, the broken ones will get nerfed, so they may become more viable in the future. Another honorable mention is to go visit Banshee44 and buy his weapon mods. Those are very good to have as well. Grow your mod collection, so when we talk about these mods, you already have some to play around with. We'll talk about exotic armor and the popular combat style mods in the next episode. But that's it for now. If you found this useful, all I ask is for you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I'm Apollo and I'm out.